Hello everybody, John Felt here. This is the Blue Water Outlook Weekly Weather Briefing, October 6, 2019. You know, this pattern we've had for quite some time now, really amplified flow, has brought in record cold, record snow to parts of the western U.S., drought and record high temperatures to the southeast U.S., and then in the middle, a lot of rain and flooding. So it does look like that that type of pattern is going to change as we go through this week. And it's going to bring a pretty good chance of a hard freeze with some very cold air moving into the Midwest. So I'm going to talk about that. It's supposed to be a quiet time of the year, but a lot going on. So let's get started. Well, once again, right here in the middle part of the nation is where we've had the most action as far as precipitation. I've talked about that the last couple weeks, where this is really the clash, the boundary, the gradient between the cold weather up to this region here and the hot weather down here. So last week we had quite a bit of rain. We're getting harvest delays across these areas, mainly Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Soggy fields. We need a break from some rain in those areas to get back in there and resume harvest operations. Now, areas in yellow, 2 inches of rain or more. Areas of red, 5. So generally, if you look closely, the darker shades of sort of brown and red, I think that's where the biggest issues are. No rain over the southeast U.S. It's been very dry. We've even had some snow, definitely in higher elevations, but also parts of North Dakota showing that transition into the core parts of fall. And fall really changeable. The early part of fall is typically pretty pleasant like summer. Latter part of fall, we start to get a taste of winter. Now, one thing I see here that certainly looks more fall-like is we're beginning to replace some of this muggy, moist air here. Look at dew points, 60s and 70s, with some much cooler and drier air, or I should say much drier air on here. Dew points, 30s and 40s, much drier even further out to the west. So that's pushing towards the east and southeast. Muggy air is being replaced with this fall-like drier air. Now, last week was definitely a week of extremes with unusually cold weather, sort of centered over Montana, record-breaking temperatures over the southeast U.S., mid-Atlantic, Ohio River Valley. Matter of fact, if you want to look at areas that have received temperatures above 95 degrees, the number of days out of the last 7, well, we're looking at anything in the orange or red, at least 5 out of the last 7 days. Areas in yellow, 4 out of the last 77 days, 95 degrees. And this time of year, more than likely, those were record-setting temperatures. So record heat. And this area is also really dry. I'm going to be talking about that this week. I would classify this as a flash drought, so I want to talk about that in a post early this week. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it now because I will be discussing it. But again, look at the anomalies here. Unusually wet. So should we get excessive rain in this area, we'd get an excess or very quick runoff. This area down here, on the other hand, can take many inches of rain, generally speaking, before we get into too much of a problem. Okay, tropics, as I've sort of mentioned, I think I put an update out last Monday. Tropics, we're going through the very quick decrease from a climatological standpoint in activity. And, you know, I'm not sure if there's a whole lot of research into this, but I tend to look at it like there's a certain amount of overall energy in any given season, and sort of once you bleed that off, sort of potential energy, once you sort of bleed that off with kinetic energy, with Lorenzo and Dorian, you know, sometimes, you know, the season begins to wrap up. Now, these could be famous last words. We could have a big ramp up. But overall, it looks pretty quiet here, and there's not much coming off the African coast that looks impressive. So it might be quiet as we get into the rest of October. We'll see. I did want to mention that as we get into the latter part of the season, once again, development areas pull into the Gulf and into the Caribbean. So what we want to watch here is, remember that front that's coming down here? If that would get into the Gulf, or off the east coast here, sometimes that's where we can get development along those stalled fronts. So let's watch that. Models don't indicate that. The Hurricane Center doesn't indicate that. But let's just keep an eye on it. As far as stream flow goes, again, whether we're talking about the jet stream, whether we're talking about temperature, whether they're talking about the dew point. Now we're talking about stream flow. They're all related. We have much above normal stream flow over the upper Mississippi, parts of the Missouri, and we have much below normal stream flow over the eastern parts of the U.S. Red is well below normal, and black is above normal and actually near flood or above flood stage. So the upper Mississippi downstream to about Cape Girardeau, the Missouri River all the way down to St. Charles, where it merges into the Mississippi here, are all above flood stage. Communities in red, that's moderate flood, and generally once it gets below St. Louis, it begins to attenuate because it's been very dry in this reach of the river, so all this water comes down here, and then it begins to very quickly attenuate because it's been so dry. Okay, so here's where we're at. We have this dip in the jet stream, that's the cold weather. We have this ridge in the jet stream pushing north. Here's the hot weather. And as we go forward, we see some pretty big changes. This week, we see that trough in the west progress into the central and eventually in the east. And then we see, as we go forward a little bit further out, right here, maybe into week 2, we go maybe a little bit back into the original pattern. I'm going to hold off on that. We'll see. Let's instead focus on this trough that's pushing across the nation. And what that's going to do is bring some really colder air as we get into this week and next. Maybe in the second half of next week, we begin to see the warming right here come back as we start to get into that original pattern. But again, I think the big story is going to be the colder air pushing in this week. And there's the front pushing through. You can also see in Montana another front coming through, reinforcing the cold air, bringing some snow. And here's precipitation this week, and you can see it's not as much as last week over the middle part of the nation, and overall a fairly quiet precipitation week, with the exception of some maybe heavy snow over the Rockies. Now, many areas of the U.S., this is where climatology of the first occurrence of 32 degrees, anywhere north of this line usually has had the first 32 degrees from a climatological standpoint. This is where we've actually had that. So many parts of this region right in here are running pretty late as far as the first freeze. Well, take a look at Friday, or I should say Thursday and Friday. Or no, I think this is Friday and Saturday. What we have is definitely a hard freeze coming up over the upper Midwest, and that will be that first occurrence. So we will be definitely catching up on fall weather as we go through the week. 6 to 10 day, well, there's that really below normal temperature pattern in the middle part of the nation. 8 to 14. Precipitation does look a little bit more like fall. I really can't see anything all that impressive one way or the other. Now, as far as weather hazards, just real quickly, a lot of high winds behind the front over the plains. Blue is indicating that colder weather, the snow and rain over Montana and other parts of the northern plains. And overall, I think that's pretty much it. Chance of some heavier rain in the middle part of the week, right through the middle of the Midwest. That's this week's briefing. Depending where you're at, you're going to have, if you're in the southeast U.S., you're going to welcome some cooler temperatures. If you're in the northwest U.S., I think you're going to say, yet, what's going on with all this cold weather? And if you're in the middle of the U.S., you're probably going to say, hey, this finally really feels like fall weather. That's this week's briefing. Have a great week.